Hi, welcome to the making of the angel child. As you can see, I used a reference that I found off the internet. Couldn't find the same child face every time, so some of them are a little bit different. I used my skull that is molded. I have a mold and I use it every time. I used FIMO CERNIT and I used resin eyes, which I made myself. Then I started to sculpt the actual figure, so I used my triangle to do the nose. I took measurements from the front of the forehead, cheeks and jaw, took pieces of clay, added them slowly, kept measuring so that I make sure I don't go over and I just get enough to create the shape. I also keep referring to my profile picture because at this point the profile is the most important thing to me, apart from obviously the width of the face. So it's going to look very crazy for a while, as you can see. Then I added the eyes. I turned them straight away. Sometimes I don't do that. Sometimes I add the eyes facing forward and then I turn them later on, but for this one I decided to turn them straight away. So you have to measure the eyes, make sure they're in the place you want them, or they're lined up properly as best you can. Sometimes you do need to move them later on because once you've added more clay, you realize that actually the eyes aren't as lined up as you thought they were. Yeah, it can be quite frustrating, but anyway, parts of the whole process. Once I got the eyes in place, I added small pieces of clay around the eyes, sort of set them in place, carried on working on the face, because once the eyes are in, you can sort of use them as a marker to get the rest of the face, the features in. Everything works together. So I started to work on the mouth and the nose. The mouth looks a little bit pursed at the moment. I wanted it to be a little bit pursed, but not as pursed as it looked in the beginning. Then I added some more clay to the brow bones, or brow bone, we've only got one, and it is really just a process of adding as I go. I added some more clay around the nose, so around the sides of the nose, the bridge of the nose. Then sort of shaping up more the nose using my ball tools. Those are very useful for little spaces. Shaping where the nostrils will be. Adding some more clay to the forehead. This is just a question of like looking at your reference and then just adding and adding whenever you think you need it. The ears. I then smooth the face with my usual technique of mineral spirit, or white spirit as it's called sometimes, and a nice smooth brush. And it really is just building it up slowly but surely, trying not to mess with the details that you've done. Then once it was baked, I realized that the one eye, I was still not happy with it. Now this is what happens, and so I filmed it this time to show you. This is sometimes happens. It's not often, but for this one it did. And either I was going to leave the eye in place and it would bother me forevermore, or I was going to do this. And sometimes you just have to have the courage to cut into the work you've done and know that if you've done it once, you can do it again, and that if you are very careful, you can do it so that you can't see that you've done anything. So I dug into the eye very carefully and removed the eyeball. Luckily those resin eyes are really strong. As long as you don't dig out on them, you are pretty safe to be able to dig them out and remove all the clay and use it again. I needed to clean up the wound, make sure it was nice and clean and not had any mess around it. Obviously a little bit extra, take a little bit extra off so that you're not just sort of trying to squeeze the eye into a very small space. Added some more raw clay so that the eyeball could attach again or stick in place. Then lining it up again, making sure now this time that I get it right. The one iris was slightly too up, was looking a little bit too up, so it was getting the irises to align. And then once I was happy with it, I added the extra clay again, little by little, just as I did the first time. You want to take extra clay away so that you haven't got a sharp line. So you want the clay to sort of smooth out, so it's not just hitting up against where you cut the clay, so you haven't got like a clear sort of line between raw clay and baked clay, if that makes sense. You sort of need to shave more of the baked clay off so that the raw clay blends in, otherwise you could end up with cracks. Adding more clay to the eye, getting the same shape again of the eye. So I'm really just building up just as I did the first time, making sure that I don't add too much clay, smoothing it out, blending it into the baked clay that I've already got. Once I was happy with the shape of the eye was in the place I wanted it, I then can smooth it again. Once I've smoothed, I leave it for about 10 minutes, let the clay firm up again, and then add the little details like this with my tiny pointy tools. And I also use my pin tools to try and get all the little details around the eye. And then of course you've got to smooth that out again. And then she was ready to be baked, and so I baked her again for the same amount of time as I did the first time. And then it was time for painting, so I'm adding shadow into the shadow areas. So I'm just using a tone that's slightly darker than my clay color, and I'm just adding those shadows to make them deeper. and then adding details like the eyebrows and the very slight shadows around the eyes. She doesn't have makeup on, so it's very, very subtle. I usually use a little bit of dark on the upper lids to just add a little bit more color to when I add the eyelashes. It sort of makes the whole eyelash area look a bit thicker and darker. Then I was doing the hands. I use a tube to put the hand onto, to build the hand onto, which I can then glue onto the wire of the arm later on. So I've got my wire armature baked, the wire armature, and then a thin layer of clay, bake that. So I've got something firm to work on, and then I just slowly build up the raw clay, building the details of the hands and the fingers, one by one. Then once everything was added and I liked the shape of the hand, I can then smooth it like I always do. Smooth it, leave it to sit for 10 minutes so the clay firms up again, and then I can add the details like the little lines on the back of the fingers and the nails. I just use a pin tool to add the nails. It's something I've always used. It's just a pin that is embedded in some old clay and baked. Then I use my tiny brushes to help shape the nails as well. I have a nice, very tiny pin tool for doing the little lines on the hands. It's a bead needle. And then of course it was time to paint the hands, because I also paint them off the body because it's much easier that way. Extra color on the tips of the fingers, on the knuckles. Then of course painting the nails. The nails are sort of slightly off, kind of almost purpley but not quite purpley color. And then it was on to sculpting the body. As I always do, add the head once it's painted onto the armature. The armature has a layer of baked clay already just to make it solid and help me work out the pose. So I've got a very basic hip area and a chest area just to help me work out where everything goes. And then it's just a question of adding clay, looking at my reference, adding pieces of clay on both sides, trying to keep it symmetrical. I'm using a wooden tool here, which I do use a lot as well. I find that very useful for clay that is a little bit firm. Somehow the wooden tool grips the clay a little bit better and can help it blend into itself a little bit better. I also use my tool that I made myself, which is a sort of rake tool, a very, very useful tool as well for blending clay in. It's just a piece of wire with a thinner piece of wire wound around it. So I use my coarse brush, which is the first brush that I use, which is the best for getting rid of my little lines that I made with my sculpting tools. Once I've finished with my coarse brush, I can then move on to smoother brushes, because now I have to smooth out the lines that the coarse brush made. Then she was baked, and then it was time to build her legs. So once again, it's just building small pieces of clay, building up the shapes of her legs. I wanted her to look like she was pointing her toes, but she wasn't very good at it because she's a child, you know, very young child. So it's sort of a little bit clunky, if that makes sense. So this is the fourth time I've done this angel child. The same pose basically. Obviously she's a unique because she has her own face, different face, fully sculpted, different hands, slightly different positions. The feet are always in a very similar position though for this one. So I've got quite used to knowing how to sculpt this one. But every time is new and I actually enjoy it every single time. I'm just working on the feet and using my ball tool, very, very useful for doing the small areas, making sure that the foot looks like it's trying to be pointed but not quite getting it right. Then I sculpt the toes, very, very useful to have them on the base that you're going to use so you can sculpt them to the base. As you can see, I also draw areas where the feet must go so that I make sure that I know when she's standing comfortably, and then I can sculpt the foot in that comfortable position. Then it's smoothing everything out again. Then she was baked again, and I went on to sculpting her arms. So the hands were added with the tube that I had sculpted them on. I can just glue the tube and slide it onto the wire of the arm. So I just add some epoxy glue to the tube where the hand is sculpted and painted onto, and then I slide that onto the wire of the arm. And then it's just building up the arm again with little pieces of clay, smoothing it out with my rough brush first, and then going through to my smooth brushes and the mineral spirit that I always use. And then she was ready for the oven again. And while she was baking, I made some roses for the bodice of her clothes. So just rolling a piece of clay, then doing a little bit of wobbly, sort of petally looking things. I mean, these were supposed to be roses that were in fabric, so they were meant to look like fabric roses, not real roses. And I'm using my needle tools to sort of really press those roses onto the bodice. So I've got a piece of raw clay already as the bodice, and then I'm pressing those roses on because you want them to really stick on. And then the little buttons on the back of her bodice, I'm using some liquid clay to make sure that my little balls of clay stick into the holes I've made. And then once that was baked, it was painted. I wanted it to be slightly lighter colour, the pale colour of her dress, so sort of almost white. And then I moved on to painting the body. So here I am painting the feet. Again, just like the hands, shadow areas a little bit darker than the clay, a rosy kind of colour on the toes, so it looks like there's sort of more blood there. And then painting the toes with a sort of very subtly purpley colour on the beds of the nails, and then some white on the ends of the nails. And then once everything was painted and baked, it's time to add the hair. I'm doing a little bit of wispy hairs around her forehead, using my tacky glue and some viscose. And then, because she was doing pigtails, all I needed to do was put long pieces of viscose all around the hairline, all the way around, either side of the hairline and down the middle. And then pull those together and pull it into a ponytail, and then back comb them so they were nice and messy. Then I just needed to add the fabric for the dress. So I did layers. I started with a very skin tone layer so that you couldn't see through the dress, and then I added some more layers of voiles and netting. And then I added a nice big bow to the back of her dress. Thank you to all my patrons on Patreon for supporting me. I really appreciate every one of you. If you'd like to join me on Patreon, I'd be so happy to welcome you into my studio. I'm currently uploading 1 hour of sculpting tutorials each month. We've just finished sculpting the salty mermaid in a teacup, and I've posted the first part of sculpting the absinthe fairy for this month. I'd love to see you there. You can also sign up for my mailing list for free by clicking on the link in the video description. Everyone who signs up gets a free in-depth sculpting a nose tutorial. So thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and click on the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Thank you. See you again soon.